2012's Psycho Pass is not a bad show. It engages its viewers very well. The fact that I've ended up thinking about it so hard and remembering all the details after years is testament to that. Production IG and everyone else involved brought the power with this series, and it shows. It's one of those really poppy anime premises that you remember exactly how a friend enthusiastically explains it to you when it comes out. It's like a world where they find out if people are criminals before they do anything by scanning their brains, and they have guns that explode people. And that definitely is what Psycho Pass is about for the first 10-odd episodes. The human law enforcers employed by the inscrutable machine mind that rules this society have to work around the strange technical limitations and apparent murderous biases of the so-called Sibyl System, which contains criminals and select savants by constantly scanning everyone's brains and judging their general psychological well-being. It's solid cyberpunk detective material where they solve cool cyber crimes and find the raw broken mammals that appear in the supposedly locked down utopia. Let us not forget that this is one of the high effort anime from Production IG, so the presentation is absolutely fantastic. The art is excellent, the animation is fluid, the character designs are compelling, and the music and sound effects are pulse pounding. The noise rock OPs grow on you, and the ED is like the platonically ideal anime ED in my mind. The story comes to a head when our inspectors encounter a man on whom the system doesn't seem to work. The cynatic scans show his crime coefficient firmly at 0 even as he kills and jaywalks. And with their robot helpers and weapons only responding to criminals as identified by the system, they have to find solutions other than sublimating the problem with lasers. The massive computer system that runs their entire world not only has weaknesses, but you could say that their entire approach of boiling people down to a single metric has flaws, as we've spent the first few episodes establishing. So you can imagine my confusion when we get to the big twist, that the Sibyl system is not strictly a computerized system, but is actually a bunch of brains in jars judging people. I don't care what kind of mechanical explanations you think are in the lore of this show. This does not make any sense whatsoever. What we were just shown for several episodes was the results of a poorly functioning computer system, which acts in very rigid, logical ways even as it lacks inputs and seems to have been programmed with an incomplete understanding of human psychology. This is most obvious with the introduction of Shogo Makishima, the aforementioned man whose thoughts are too complex for the Sibyl system to understand. If we grant that the intelligence behind the Sibyl system is human as opposed to artificial, there's a pretty clear problem here. It's revealed that the brains want to capture this guy and acquire his gray matter anyways, and the brains have executive control over the Dominator guns. So why the fuck does his Psycho Pass score impact anything? They can just set Akane's gun to stun him right here and no one will be the wiser. A later scene establishes that the think tanks can just set phasers to kill arbitrarily. There's no excuse for why not. One almost gets the impression that Gen Urobuchi is just not well suited to writing this kind of science fiction. Like, we have this mini-arc with the all-girls school, where the explanation for how this serial killer girl has gone undetected is because there are no psychopath scanners in the school. What? In a tightly wound sci-fi world like this, where one might be tempted to draw out all the implications to their fullest, something like this fractally explodes the complexity of the setting. You're telling me that rich people can basically evade the entire Sibyl system? Does this mean it isn't nurture over nature? This is such a big idea that the whole series could basically revolve around this point. There should be at least some explanation for why this hasn't basically cleaved their entire society in two. It feels like Gen Urobuchi thinks he can treat the Sibyl system like the magic system of a fantasy show, like he's still writing Fate, and the reason that character B takes Group A by surprise is because it takes place in a location where scrying spells don't work. I would assume, then, that the reason the Sibyl system is not a computer, but brains in jars, is because 8 scripts deep into writing, Gen Urobuchi thought, hey yeah, it would be a big twist, and a room full of brains in jars would look cool in an anime. And he wrote it in, not even considering the impacts that the details have on a story like this. Did you notice how all the sort of gay characters in the show are identified by Sibyl as latent criminals or get horribly butchered? Now, there's nothing I loathe more than so-called reviews that do nothing but complain about logical errors in the plotting of fiction. So let me make it clear that no amount of throwaway explanation lines would really fix the thematic issue that The Twist introduces. Even if the world building was completely watertight, the show becomes about 10 times less interesting with the reveal that as opposed to a novel artificial intelligence technocracy, we're actually just seeing normal human authoritarianism in a fancy hat. When the Sibyl System is a computer, there are all kinds of interesting questions we're drawn to ask. Can a computer really appropriately react to the continuous efforts of humans to sneak out underneath it? Who made the Sibyl System, and how does the machine express the biases of the humans who made it? We're led to believe there might be a few. How do the machine's human gophers discolor the results? What are the pros and cons of a rigidly logical, utterly compassionless government? Genorabuchi seems to think that a government of neuroatypical psychopaths is basically the same thing. I don't know about that one, Chief. Competent authoritarianism which murders for the greater good is well-trampled ground in anime by this point. It feels like well-intentioned extremist is basically a stock character. If I specifically wanted to watch another seinen anime with shoujo character designs that explores this theme in maximal depth, I could watch Legend of the Galactic Heroes. The shit new version is basically the same character designs from the same studio. Honestly, I'm sick and tired of people acting like media is super smart and morally ambiguous for asking, what if atrocities? But for a good cause. It almost feels patronizing towards the character realism of these works. Most real-life dictators and war criminals also believe that their transgressions are some brilliant calculated sacrifice that society has rejected because they're soft. Sometimes I worry this is why people think they can just equivalent exchange a little injustice and murder into utopia for the survivors, when that's just not how things work in real life. Right next door to Japan, we see two nations with similar populations. North Korea is a totalitarian closed society of strong law enforcement and impermeable borders. South Korea is a marginally democratic nation which increasingly takes on guest labor. Guess which one looks more like Japan in this anime? It's a shame because I feel the core conflict of the main character is well conceived and has a ton of potential. Akane Tsunemori, while a scion of the system, sees through the conveyance of her duties that the system is unjust and must be approved upon, if not overturned. But she also realizes that collapsing society all of a sudden would be way worse, and that she must incrementally work her way towards change. Imagine a series where the characters have to work through the mammoth task of slowly removing the Sibyl System from society, or experience the unintended consequences of tiny improvements they try to make to its functioning. It's a shame, then, that neither this show nor its sequels seem at all interested on delivering on this in any way. It's much more concerned with the predestined BBC Sherlock mind battle between Kogami and Makishima. I mean, this is all perfectly serviceable thriller anime material. It was no less compelling when it was Tenma and Yohan. But for all their time referencing literature that most English speakers read in high school, and consulting the oracles on 2chan, I fail to see how this is a deep intellectual conflict like how the show frames it. One guy wants to tear down the system because he thinks it's a spook that gets in the way of his doing crimes, and the other guy just wants to kill him for murdering his friend. It sounds like I'm being reductive, but I'm not. There's a couple scenes where the villain prattles on about how we live in a society in the vaguest terms, but there's no substantive dialogue about this world, or even chemistry with the protagonists. Like, Makishima is reading George Orwell's 1984, which, while it is an eye-roller of a reference by this point, at least accurately describes what he believes, that the Sibyl Society corrodes the human spirit and turns people into drones. Thing is, his criticism completely misses the mark because all the characters we meet in this story seem like they're straight out of our real-world society, often to an unrealistic degree. Totally normie characters like Akane's friends not only understand the concept of freedom, but actively desire it, which definitely is not the mark of an Orwellian society. I just wish we would cite some other literature on totalitarianism for once, like, I don't know, Darkness at Noon? Someone at Production IG must know who Kostler is. God, I just wish someone would make a The Left Hand of Darkness anime already. For the Dojins. Well, not every show has to be super smart, I hear you say. Can't something just be a fun thriller action series? Of course it can. I definitely enjoyed Psycho Pass enough on those grounds. But this series was marketed as a spiritual successor to Ghost in the Shell's standalone complex, a show whose ideas have captivated people going on 2 decades, in large part because the big idea and the social commentary strikes close to home. And if I wanted to watch a dumb fun cyberpunk thing by Production IG, Real Drive has shit like thick gynoids and a dog hive minds and a robot that does nothing but break people's limbs out of incel rage. Psycho Pass puts on some pretensions of commentary, of self-importance, but it's too caught up in its own aesthetic of robots, ray guns, and monologuing villains for it to even break its own internal status quo. Protagonists who have basically seen the Sibyl System at its worst barely even voice their discontent, never mind actively do anything about it. Japan in standalone complex is perhaps an even less desirable society, but in that world people have precious little ability to change things. Section 9 is obliterated the moment they get in someone's way. In Psycho Pass, on the other hand, Great Man Theory is in effect. The villain on his own nearly manages to completely overturn their society. The protagonists have been given the freedom to choose in the ear of those in power. Perhaps it wouldn't be realistic for them to succeed in changing civil society for the better, not on the first try, but seeing sympathetic characters try and fail with good intentions would be excellent drama. Better than the warmed-over supervillain shtick the franchise defaults to. So yeah, my enjoyment of Psycho Pass is undermined by inflated expectations. But what can I say? I only wish I could scan anime for their quality coefficient before viewing.